Thank you very much. It's a particular honor and pleasure to be here back at my alma mater. I've spent many hours in this particular room listening to eye-opening lectures and very thought-provoking speeches, and so it's wonderful to be here. And of course, it's a great honor to be able to discuss papers of two scholars that whose work I admire deeply. One who has indoctrinated me for about 5 years, and to be able to share some thoughts on their analyses. So we have two papers here, one that discusses Turkish politics through the lens of political society. How do religious politics constitute themselves in political society meaning in particular opposition parties, and an opposition party that then became the governing party, and another paper that looks at religious politics through the lens of state-religion relations, an institutional perspective focusing on the state. I will start with the paper by Stathis Kalyvas, and I will highlight two questions in particular. The question of analogy: how much can one use the example of Christian democratic parties in order to try and analyze the AK party in Turkey? This could also be applied to the PKS in Indonesia, for example, two democratizing Muslim countries that have generated Muslim opposition parties that, in the case of Turkey, has become a governing party or a party in power. How much are these contexts comparable, and to what extent may there be conceptual problems arising out of this analogy? My second body of comments will focus on the question of does religious mobilization necessarily need to be anti-system, and can we not also think about religious mobilization in the context of democratization politics that is constructive, which would be sort of the mirror case to a Kalyvas paper? And then in my final comments on this paper, I will focus on just a few particular points. So first, with regard to the question of analogy, I think three questions here emerge in particular. And the first one is the context in which parties emerge. Now, the Christian parties in Europe, and predominantly we're talking about Catholic parties here, emerged in political contexts and states that were secularizing, but not yet fully secularized. And so these were parties that usually try to protect or to rescue some sort of privilege, sometimes for Catholic minorities, parties that try to make sure that they would not be subject to laws that would violate their conception of natural law, whereas the AK party in Turkey, and this can also be said about the PKS in Indonesia, emanate from constituencies that form themselves in opposition to a secularized and an aggressive secularized society, an aggressively secularized state. So you have the Turkish form of Laiklik and an Indonesian modernized secular state under the President Suharto that bring about the emergence of political parties now in the period of democratization that predominantly see themselves in opposition to this aggressive process of secularization that their societies have experienced. And I think that is possibly quite a different context from the emergence of the Catholic parties in Europe that were part of a process of the secularizing state and not arising in opposition to a state top-down process of secularization. Second, with regard to the idea of credible commitment and signaling, something that I find conceptually very, very appealing and also very persuasive, and of course the talk here built very much on your paper on commitment problems in emerging democracies, where this idea is very beautifully highlighted. Again, I think with regard to the comparison, the Catholic parties in Europe versus the AK party in Turkey, or the Algerian example, the question of the centralization and decentralization of the religious institution is important. And of course, this is your third dimension that you try to look at in terms of analyzing the institutional context in which these parties emerge and operate. Now, of course, the Catholic Church is a centralized actor. You write, this is in sharp difference to the situation in Muslim-majority countries. That's not entirely the case, or not necessarily, I think. You do find examples such as the large Islamic organizations in Indonesia that actually have a centralized structure, and that also, importantly, have a Shura Council that actually decides on the theological dogma that should be represented by the organization and accepted by its members. So you do have examples of centralized religious organizations. State-instituted ulama councils would be another example. State-appointed Grand Muftis. So you may find a centralized structure also of religious institutions in Muslim-majority societies. But what is different, I think, is that very often, for example, the state-appointed ulama council has a very different status in terms of authenticity than the Catholic Church would have here with regard to Catholic believers. And so if the Catholic Church can credibly signal a commitment on part of Catholic parties because it expects its members to follow the Catholic Church's or the Vatican's interpretation of faith, then that might not be the case with state ulama councils, and perhaps even not with these Shura councils of religious organizations in Muslim-majority society. So here it is a commitment problem with regard to the believers rather than secular incumbents who are trying to decide whether they will trust this emerging religious party to compete for votes. And finally, I wonder whether there may also be a difference with regard to the transnational status, the legal status of the Catholic Church. Now here we have an outside force intervening, of course not directly but indirectly, into local politics by suggesting a certain interpretation of theological questions that it expects local believers to accept. And the fact of a transnational actor here intervening is also something quite different, I think, from local theological councils deciding on what religious institutions and movements should represent as the authentic faith. So the question of centrality, centralization, and the question of the transnational character of the Catholic Church here, I think, actually make for quite a different situation of the case of Catholic parties in Europe in the late 19th century with comparison to Muslim parties in the contemporary Muslim-majority world. Second, now, my other body of comments relates to the question of religious mobilization and the fact, or the question whether religious mobilization necessarily needs to be anti-system. I can personally think of a number of examples where religious mobilization may have had a constructive role in the erosion of authoritarian power and perhaps even in a democratic consolidation process, or where at least both may have been going on simultaneously, a constructive process with regard to certain aspects of democratization and a not so constructive influence with regard to other aspects of democratization. Now, I would like to point to some research that I personally think is very interesting that has been done at Harvard, at the Harvard Research Project for Religion and Global Order. This is a project that Tim Shah, Monica Duffy-Toft, and Dan Philpott have been involved in. And they have looked at processes of democratization between 1960 and 2004 and have found that in about 80 cases of regime change, in a third of 80 cases of regime change, religious movements played a constructive role for some part in this process. So in a third of 80 cases, religious organizations had a constructive role to play either in the erosion of authoritarian power or in the consolidation of democratic regimes. And what did they find did this hinge upon? The question of whether religious organizations could have a positive role to play. Well, interestingly enough, they did not find that this might be a question of how liberal the values were that this particular religious movement or organization may have represented, how gender egalitarian it was organized, but instead they found it depended very much on the position of this religious organization vis-à-vis the regime. how legally autonomous and how financially autonomous were religious movements vis-a-vis political incumbents, and how did this help them, for example, mobilize for demonstrations, in particular with regard to the question of legal autonomy. There's a famous case of the East German churches that actually had a constructive role insofar as their internal church communication could not be intercepted by the Stasi due to an agreement between the East German government and the Soviets from 1953. Now, this helped in the late 80s. This helped very substantively democratic activists who could use the churches for this channels of communication in order to organize protests and demonstrations and so on. And secondly, this element of financial autonomy that has been very helpful for the case of the Catholic democratization in Latin America, right? The fact that from Rome, the Catholic Church had been able to financially support local democratization movements. So it was not so much a question of theology, but rather the extent to which domestic or local religious organizations had financial and legal autonomy from the regime that allowed them to present a powerful challenge to authoritarianism. Now, this mirrors in some respect your reservation about the question of theology. You highlight in the paper that it is necessary for us to go beyond the question of how compatible are certain religions with democratic values and human rights, because what really matters is how concrete religious actors and movements behave in particular institutional circumstances. That is why these three dimensions, institutional dimensions, figure so squarely in your analysis. But nevertheless, we talk about the third wave of democratization as the Catholic wave, right? And it is a wave of democratization that took place after Vatican II. So dogmatic change here did play a very important role in at least, I think, allowing religious actors to make certain arguments in public. And this may be quite important, I think, if we put it into the context of the construction of a democratic alternative that Alfred Stepan has written about. The question of how much are opposition movements in an authoritarian regime able to conceptualize a democratic alternative that can be found to be a model that diverse opposition movements agree upon, strive towards. And here I think these dogmatic changes may actually be quite important. In particular, if we think about how religious actors, religious authorities may interfere into a process of the erosion of authoritarian power and trying to mobilize religious believers, not on the basis of democratic values, but either on the basis of the authoritarian regime that is in power or on the basis of an Islamist alternative. And so in terms of thinking about the construction of a democratic alternative and on making this a position that can be represented by local religious authorities, it is quite important to look also at theological change, and then in the next step to see under which circumstances and under which institutional conditions can this liberalization in theology be translated into an advocacy for democratic change. Now, finally, to some detailed or minor comments. I wondered whether in the analysis one could look more closely at the AK party in Turkey and really try to use these three dimensions to identify turning points in Turkish politics with regard to your first dimension, the opportunities that exist in a given political regime for a religious movement to emerge and to express itself in the form of a political party. I wonder whether 1961, with the expansion of political rights and civil liberties in Turkey, this might have been such a turning point for broader toleration for opposition politics. With regard to your second dimension, the question of what are the electoral constraints that a religious movement faces, I wonder whether perhaps the summer of 2008 may have been a turning point. For many, I think, very, very unexpected decision on part of the Supreme Court to not outlaw the AK party as it did with its predecessors, Virtue and Welfare Party, whether these might be turning points that actually correspond to two of the three dimensions that you outline as your conceptual instrumentarium. And then finally, I wonder, in this debate about moderation, Kerry Rosevsky-Wickham, Janine Clark, Julian Schwedler, the debate between political scientists trying to analyze and to identify the most important elements that condition moderation on part of religious organizations and movements have circled around the question of learning. Do we trace moderation also back to learning processes, or is it a question of generational change? I think in the case of the AK Party, many would also make the argument that generational change here does play quite a large role, and it's not only institutional or learning that is induced through institutional rules. And then second to the question as to in which areas does the party moderate? I think here one could look more closely at particular policy realms. Is it with regard to criminal law? Is it with regard to personal status law, with a stand on economic policy, interest, and so on? What about the Diyanet? Is the funding of imams ever an issue? What are the areas in which the party is willing to concede to secularizing politics and in other ways? Actually, that's the wrong expression here, secularizing politics. In which areas is it willing to concede to the demands of the old establishment, if you will, and in which area is it trying to stay true or trying to insist on policy stances that it has represented for quite some time? So I will move now to the discussion of the paper on state-religion relations in Turkey, Senegal, and France. And I do have one or two slides that I would like to show in this regard. So if you could move to slide 3. Yeah. The first point, and of course I entirely agree with this, is the question of the nature of secular regimes and the empirical multiplicity of forms of secularism, multiple secularisms that one could also use as an expression, and it is the title of one of the papers by Alfred Stepan. The slide that I'm going to show you is a slide that actually lists some of the data that Alfred Stepan mentioned in his talk. This is from the Religion and State data set. I will show you the scores of Muslim-majority countries, European countries, and a differentiation between the Arab and the non-Arab Muslim world. To give you, could you move to slide 3? Thank you. So the scores that you're about to see are scores that are a composite of 5 different dimensions. This is the Religion and State data set by John Fox, a political scientist from Bar Ilan University. What he takes into consideration when assigning scores in terms of how much the state regulates religion in this collection of countries, the elements that he takes into consideration here for each score are 5. So these are composite scores for 5 dimensions. The first one is there an established religion, yes or no? Is there more than one established religion, yes or no? The second one, to what extent is the majority religion regulated? Does the state, for example, pay for mosques, synagogues, churches? Does the state put imams, preachers, pastors on its payroll or not? Does the state interfere with certain religious practices or not? The third dimension looks at the same questions with regard to the minority religions that exist in a given society. The fourth dimension looks at legislation. To what extent does the state, for example, support religious legislation with regard to conversion? Is conversion legal? Is civil marriage introduced, or does it have to be religious marriage? What is the state's role with regard to nutrition laws, and so on? And then the final dimension is enforcement levels, looking at what is on the books in the constitution and legislation vis-a-vis how much do states really enforce these regulations. So it is, to summarize, regulation of the majority, the minority religion, to what extent legislation is influenced by religious considerations, and how much this is enforced. So what you see here is The lowest level of state religion regulation is the United States with a 0. The highest one is Saudi Arabia with 77 on the lower right corner. And then you have a number of countries in between. What surprises many observers is that here in Europe, Germany, France, Austria, Denmark, the UK, we find much higher levels of religion-state regulation than the depiction of secular would make many believe. Greece with 33 here is on the same level as Bangladesh, a Muslim-majority country. Interestingly enough, Indonesia and Turkey are the two Muslim-majority states among the democratizing ones that are the most highly regulating religion, whereas Mali, Albania, Senegal are have much lower levels of religion-state regulation. And one more point that I should point out is that in terms of the constitution and legislation, the United States is not so different from many other states, and John Fox actually identifies up to 50. But the fact is that through Supreme Court activism, the Establishment Clause, of course, has been interpreted since 1947 as constituting a wall of separation between religion and state, and that the enforcement level is much higher in the U.S. than in most other states that have similar constitutional and legislative regulations with regard to state-religion relations as the U.S. does. So what this table, I think, just sort of highlights is we have a number of long-standing democracies here in the second column, from the U.S. to Greece, many of which now have an experience of democratic politics of more than 50 years, and the high levels of state religion regulation have not stood in the way of democratic consolidation here. At the same time, we find a number of Muslim-majority countries that actually have much lower levels of religion-state regulation than the European middle, and maybe on their way towards democratic consolidation. If we can go to the next slide, I will just show you this is the collection of 6 states in the Muslim world that by dominant political science criteria are classified as democratizing, although Niger is very questionable now with regard to its score on civil rights. But what you see on the left-hand side is the religion and state data set, the same that informed the analysis of the previous slide. Then you see the Polity 4, which is the data set that Alfred Stepan mentioned that classifies countries between minus and plus 10 being the most democratic. And so Albania here with plus 9 is the most considered to be the most democratic out of Muslim-majority countries, with Senegal and Turkey following. Oh, I'm sorry, actually, Indonesia is 8 and Turkey is 7. The bottom two scores need to be swapped. So Indonesia and Senegal following Albania, and then Turkey and Mali scoring a little bit lower. And then finally, in the final column, you see how Freedom House classifies these 6 countries. If you could move to slide 2. Yes, 2. This one. This is a slide, I think, that underscores the point that Al Stepan made in terms of pointing out the variety of secularisms, first of all, that exist, and also the variety that may be democratically compatible. So if we look at this as a continuum between state regulation over religion and the regulation of the state through religious authorities, we could look at Turkey as one example on the extreme, and Iran as an example on the other extreme, whereas you find a number of countries in the middle that have established what in the language of the twin tolerations would be these realms of toleration between the state and the religious sphere. That does not mean they are institutionally neatly separate, but that they cooperate on certain grounds and at the same time leave each other legal space on others. So you have this democratic middle here at the center of the slide, and it can go both with high levels of cooperation between religion and state and also very low levels, as is the example of the United States. Okay. Now, state-religion relations are also changing and being renegotiated periodically, and I think that is something that comes through beautifully in the Kuru Stepan paper, when the paper tries to analyze where do these different models of state-religion relations emanate from. Maybe we could just make it black for the moment, because I don't need the slide. Thank you. So we have a story here of institutional diffusion. Turkey and Senegal having both been influenced and informed by the French model like no other model, but at the same time arriving at very, very different contextual applications. And in the paper, the authors here talk of the critical junctures. Mostly these are processes or periods of constitution drafting processes in all three cases. In all three countries here, this is the case. In the constitution drafting process, of course, the most fundamental model of religion-state relations are laid out and then exert this path-dependent effect on the politics following the constitutional years. Now, these are modified in later periods by, in the case of Turkey, by interventions of the military coup, or one could also say in the case of Turkey and the United States, through Supreme Court activism, the Supreme Court redefining to some extent the fundamentals of religion-state relations through a particular interpretation of constitutional clauses. And that brings us back to something that we discussed this morning. Mahmoud Landani has left, but he asked the question about Talal Assad's notion of secularism really as being a state-driven process that is often the result of particular elite struggles. And that is something that is mirrored very much in the analysis of the three cases here. The elite struggles that take place, at least in France and Turkey, in the late years of the Ancien Regime that precedes the new polity, and that is reflected in the way in which religion-state relations are being decided upon during the constitution-making period that then lays down the fundament for the particular type of secularism that is enacted afterwards. So these elite struggles are central, and very much religion-state relations here are an expression of the different ideological positions that were at place at the time of the constitution drafting process. Now, what are the minimum conditions of these different models of secularism? And that leads us back to something that was hotly discussed yesterday. I know some of you also went to the conference at the New School that brought together a panel that discussed different modes of secularism similar to our discussions here today, but often in a from the viewpoint of political philosophy and legal theory, much more so than from the viewpoint of political science and particular institutional constellations that emanate from this. If you could show us slide number 1. This will lead us to different notions of secularism and questions. This is the final slide I will show you, and the questions that lead me here towards both Alfred Stepan and Ahmed Kuru in terms of how they decide to conceptually differentiate different secular models from one another. So Alfred Stepan, famous for the twin tolerations, mutual spheres of respect and non-interference between state and religion that are renegotiated periodically and are flexible and changing, and really cover a wide variety of possible relations between religion and state that all in their own way may be democratically compatible. Charles Taylor, who so much emphasizes in his work on Quebec the extent to which the state, the secular state, should try and maximize positive freedom in the sense of maximizing the ability of religious groups to practice their religion openly and in public, that it does not need to be a privatized practice of religion, but at the same time strive towards equal treatment of both of different religious groups and also of religious vis-a-vis non-religious groups, so that it won't be the case that religious groups are going to be prioritized over those that decide not to take religious positions. Now, this is sympathetic to Rajiv Bhargava's notion, informed by the Indian model of secularism, of principled distance, that is not the same as equidistance. The idea is not that we don't have a strict separation of religion and state. By contrast, the state tries to engage in a sort of equal relation to the variety of religious groups on the ground, which arguably may be something that many European states try to fulfill now, trying to ask Muslim groups to erect institutional structures similar to prevalent Catholic and Protestant groups in order to define similar modes of engagement with these. And we know of the council that has been so closely analyzed in the case of France by Joan Scott and by John Bowen. This is an example of the state asking a religious minority to form an institutional structure similar to that with which it has been able to engage with Christian majority groups for decades. This would be the model of equidistance, but this is not what Bhargava represents and what I think Charles Taylor is sympathetic to. Rather, it is a very contextual application of trying to do justice to a variety of religious position and the non-religious position, which includes for Bhargava, in the case of India, also to allow for the institution of religious law for Muslim minority. So my question with regard to Alfred Stepan would be, your model of equal respect and equal support in the paper, is that closer to the equidistant position, or is it actually closer to Bhargava's position that would also allow for that would include the possibility of communitarian accommodations of religious groups, which would move you a little bit away from the liberal position. The question to Ahmed Kuru from me would be, and I will leave it at that because we are running out of time and I will not cover the last 2 points. My question to Ahmed Kuru would be, on the one hand, the paper, of course, highlights the continuum of relationships. At the same time, you insist on a binary classification of passive versus assertive secularism. And to what extent does that justice to the variety of secularisms that we encounter? And how, more explicitly, would you deal with cases such as Denmark and Germany that were sort of in the middle range here in the slides that I showed you at the beginning, that seem to neither really render credence to an argument that says, well, these are not cases of assertive secularism, but can they be grouped together with the United States as examples of passive secularism? Probably not either. And so where would you stand on this? And secondly, Senegal, in your paper, is classified as an example of passive secularism, just like the United States is in your other work, and they are quite different, right? I mean, you do have public religious instruction in Senegal. You have these partnerships with Sufi orders in terms of family planning and so on, that examples that Alfred Stepan also summarized in his talk. How do you account for these differences if both models stand for a passive secularist system? And perhaps more importantly, what is the positive content of these two classifications? Do they mostly make sense as binaries and in opposition to one another, or do they actually have positive content that do not explain their meaning in opposition to the other? Thank you.